Welcome everyone. I want to welcome you to the second presentation in the Lieberthal-Rogel Center for Chinese Studies noon lecture series for the winter term 2023. The complete series schedule is available here today in hard copy over on a table there, and it's also on the center's website. And email reminders are sent out weekly, or even more than weekly, in my experience. So the next presentation after today will take place on Tuesday, February 7th, and will be given by Ian McCormick, Khyentse Lecturer in Buddhist Studies, Hebrew University of Jerusalem, who will be speaking on Making a Buddhist State, Productivity as a Political Value in Early Modern Tibet. As the talk today is both on Zoom and live in person, we're going to request that a mic be used to ask questions during the Q&A so that the virtual audience can also hear your questions. And we have people here who will distribute good people, who will distribute the microphones in person. So it gives me great pleasure to say that today's presentation will be given by Adam Brookes, author and journalist. He grew up in the United Kingdom, studied Chinese at the School of Oriental and African Studies, now part of the University of London. For many years, indeed, when I first met him more than 25 years ago, he was a famed journalist with the BBC in Beijing, and before that in Jakarta, and after that in Washington, DC. And he's part of a famed duo of two famed, again, journalists. His wife is Susan Lawrence, who many of you know as a journalist, but she's now at the Congressional Research Service in Washington, DC. So he's put aside being a hack, and now he's a writer, which is better than being a hack. And he's going to speak to us about his latest book, and actually his first nonfiction book, since he put aside hackery. And it's entitled Fragile Cargo, The World War II Race to Save the Treasures of China's Forbidden City, which is about to be published in this country by Simon and Schuster in February, and is already published in the UK. So please join me in welcoming Adam Brookes. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Nico. Thank you very much, University of Michigan. Thank you, Nico, for inviting me. Thank you, Ina, for setting this all up. Thank you all for coming. It's a real privilege to be here. And the story that I tell in this book is primarily a story about people, museum curators, art historians, who facilitate a colossal act of conservation and preservation. It's also a story about art, the art of China, the imperial art of China. But above all that, it's a story about war. It's a story about the Second World War in China, which I feel quite strongly we in the Anglophone world have sort of memory hold. We don't allow it to intrude into the historiography of World War II and our popular understanding and representation of World War II at all. So in Fragile Cargo, I tried to tell this granular story of what happened to the imperial art collections in World War II, and I tried to locate them within the history of World War II in China in all its extraordinary, monstrous, brutal scale. Let's start here. Okay, can anybody tell me where that is? What's that structure? What are you looking at? Anybody? Yeah, it's the Meridian Gate. It's the southern entrance to the Forbidden City. That part of the imperial city in Peking in which the imperial family and their court lived, and only they were free to live and move. It was home to the emperors of the Ming Empire and the Qing Empire. And beyond the imperial family itself and the court, inside there, beyond those walls, there resides a colossal collection of art. It's hidden, it's unseen. A lot of it is in storage. Most of it is just for the eyes of the emperor himself. There are paintings, porcelain, jades, bronzes, thrones, clocks, tapestries, jewels, books, encyclopedias, entire archives, massive variety. These collections played many different roles. Some of them were decorative, some were ritual, some were functional. The collections were deeply intertwined with the imperial mystique. and the secrecy and hiddenness that surrounds the emperors of the Ming and the Qing. 1912, the Qing Empire comes to its end. The young, fragile Republic of China is established. Puyi, the last emperor, is allowed to stay on inside the Forbidden City under agreement with the new Beiyang government of the Republic of China. Much art at this time goes missing. A lot of it is stolen. Puyi himself, the last emperor, writes that art was getting sold just to keep up with palace expenses. Fast forward to November 1924. Puyi is with his wife, the Empress Wanrong, inside the imperial apartments, chatting and eating fruit, when troops of the warlord Feng Yuxiang burst in and order him and his retinue to leave the Forbidden City forever, which he does. The Forbidden City is now empty, except for its colossal collections of art. Rumors spread all over Peking that the warlord, Feng Yuxiang, is going to pack up the imperial art collections and cart them off on camel trains for sale to foreigners. In fact, he doesn't do anything of the sort. He does the opposite. His new cabinet in Peking appoints the Qingshi Shanhou Weiyuan Hui, the Committee for the Disposition of the Qing Household, which takes responsibility for all the imperial possessions, the palaces, the art, everything. The committee's first task is to establish exactly what lies inside the Forbidden City. And in December 1924, teams go into the freezing, dark, silent halls of the Forbidden City, and they start cataloguing every single item that lies within. This gives you some idea what it looked like. This is an image from the time of inventory teams working in the Imperial Archive, sorting through vast mountains of disordered documents, trying to establish what they were. Who were the people on these inventory teams? Well, they were professors and students, mostly from Peking University. People who understood what it was they were looking at, could take a reasonably good stab at identifying a piece of jade or a painting or whatever it was. Above all, they could be trusted not to steal it. Most importantly for this story, this guy. Anybody recognize him? Not really. A greatly overlooked character in 20th century Chinese art history. His name is Ma Heng. He's born in 1881, just outside Shanghai. His father was a Qing magistrate. He was an excellent student, a precocious student of traditional learning in the antiquarian style from a young age. He studied inscriptions. He learned to read classical Chinese and poetry. He learned calligraphy. He learned to cut seals when he was a boy. When he was 21, he marries into a rich family in Shanghai, very wealthy business family in Shanghai. And for the next 15 years, through his 20s and into his 30s, he's a businessman. He looks after the family hardware. There's a chain of hardware stores. There's a bank. There are silk factories, match factories, all sorts of interests in commercial modernizing Shanghai. He lives a gilded life in the concessions in Shanghai. But he always yearns to be a scholar. And in 1917, he decides to change his life. He moves to Peking and he takes up a position on the faculty at Beida, at Peking University, as it expands under its visionary new leader, Tsai Yuen-pei. Ma Heng becomes well known at Beida. He makes friends with some of the greatest scholars of the time, including people like Hu Shi, and he is invited to join the inventory teams in 1924 as they go into the Forbidden City, and he is a key figure in establishing the catalogue of the imperial art collections in 1924. What did they find when they went into those dark halls? Well, they found paintings like this, 1,000 years old, a hand scroll by Zhao Gan. It's called, usually translated as Early Snow on the River, from the 5 Dynasties and 10 Kingdoms period. It's one of my favorites, which is why I stick it up here. It's a beautifully, closely observed study of fishermen on a river in the Jiangnan area of China in the 5 Dynasties period. They found pictures like this, herd of deer in an autumn grove, from the Liao Empire, the Khitan Empire, also similar period, probably 10th century. No humanistic statement here this time, a pure nature study, fabulous, closely observed study of nature and anatomy of these beautiful, beautiful deer. They found mountains of porcelain, including stuff like this, a ewer from the Xuande period of the Ming Empire with its unique and vanishingly rare and irreplaceable red glaze, its copper red glaze, of the sort that was only manufactured for a couple of decades under Xuande, and as such is some of the most prized porcelain in all of Chinese art. It's very important to understand that these Forbidden City collections, the Imperial art collections, had never been seen. They were not for the public's eyes. So when the inventory teams went in, they were not just cataloguing, they were building out a preliminary understanding of a vast, hidden artistic and intellectual inheritance. One of the curators on the teams, Zhuang Yan was his name, a young archaeologist from Peking University, wrote that the cold inside the Forbidden City in December 1924 was intense. They were all freezing. None of the stoves were lit. It was dark, it was silent, it was gloomy, forbidding. The whole Forbidden City was a terrible mess. Buildings were falling down, the trees were falling down, there were piles of slag and cinders and ash everywhere. But he said, despite the cold, despite the awful conditions, what drove everybody on, he wrote, was the pure joy and fascination of being the first to find out how life in the imperial court of the Ming and Qing had really been lived, what it was really like. These inventory teams were the first people to see, really, what had happened in the imperial court. Here is Ma Heng again, in a beautiful portrait drawn by his friend, the artist Xu Beihong, in the late 1920s. Ma Heng plays an important role in 1925 in the establishment of the Palace Museum, the Gugong, which will live inside the Forbidden City, and still does today live inside the Forbidden City. The Gugong takes charge of all the imperial art collections, and the Palace Museum, the Gugong, opens on National Day 1925. By the late 1920s, Ma Heng is in his 40s. He's a successful scholar. He has a post at the Palace Museum, a post at Peking University. The museum is as close as to flourishing as it will ever get under the Republic of China. It's the central institution of the Republic of China at the time. And the antiquities within the museum have undergone a transformation. They are no longer the private, secret hoard of emperors. They've become national objects, guobao, or even state objects, right? You could translate that as state object. They are the property of a young nation state, and their role is to educate the public, but also, I think, to try and generate a sense of national identity and a sense of shared national history among the citizens of a new, struggling, modernizing republic. And then the story completely changes. 1931. Japan seizes Manchuria. 1932, Japan attacks in Shanghai. The Japanese Navy bombs Shanghai. Half of northern Shanghai burns under Japanese incendiary bombs. Crucially at this point, Japanese aircraft in Shanghai hit the Commercial Press Building, which is a publishing house, and the Oriental Library, which is attached to it, which is a sort of museum and storehouse of valuable texts. Hundreds of irreplaceable texts and paintings and objects, thousands, are destroyed in this bombing raid. And people suddenly understand that when modern air forces bomb cities, when they conduct aerial terror bombing, they don't just kill people and burn buildings, they eviscerate culture too. And this is really the first time that people have understood the true impact of aerial terror bombing. And what we're seeing here, of course, is a prefiguring of the broader global conflict of the Second World War. 1933, Japan moves out of its positions in Manchuria. It takes Rehe province and Shanhai Guan. The Japanese are now at the Great Wall. Up in the north, they've moved up to the Great Wall. They're only 4 hours away from Peking by road. At some point in 1932 or early 33, the decision is taken by the Palace Museum in consultation with the government that the imperial collections inside the Forbidden City, to save them from the Japanese and from air raid, must be evacuated from Peking. The imperial collections that have been in the Forbidden City for centuries must leave. Absolutely essential to this endeavor was the packing of the collections. They can't pack everything. It's over 1 million objects. They can't take all of it. So they have to select which bits they're going to take. They select roughly about between 1/3 and 1/4 of the total of the collections. I use as a shorthand about 250,000 objects and texts, but it depends how you count it. There are very few images of this process, but this is the best one. You can see them taking objects and packing them in wooden cases that the museum had brought in. They brought in cotton wadding, paper, hemp cord, rice husks, and all sorts of packing materials. And they began to pack. They packed for months and months and months. They packed 28,000 pieces of porcelain, 8,000 paintings. The antiquities department alone, which was one of 4 departments in the museum at the time, packed 63,000 items. All told, 19,557 of these cases, of these wooden cases, are packed. Early 1933, the cases are taken out from the halls. They're assembled in the courtyards, ready for evacuation from the Forbidden City by rail. They'll be taken down to Tianmen railway station, loaded aboard freight trains, and the first tranche of their journey, strangely enough, is to Shanghai. Weird decision, considering the place has just been bombed by the Japanese. But the thinking on the part of the Palace Museum is that these 20,000 cases packed full of irreplaceable art will be safest in the foreign concessions. So they are taken to Shanghai, where they are stored in a disused hospital on the Rue Montauban in the French concession. It's a highly disorganized, troubled effort. It takes weeks to get the cases down there. They get stuck in Nanjing for weeks and weeks. The whole thing is chaos. But eventually they get the cases down there and they begin to accumulate in this disused hospital in Shanghai. Ma Hong, at the same time, is overseeing construction of new permanent storage warehouses in Nanjing, in what today is the Nanjing Municipal Museum, the Chaotian Palace Complex in Nanjing. These new warehouses have a bomb-proof vault. They have air conditioning. It's the latest technology that the world has to offer. And the belief is that the Imperial art collections will be safest there. And in late 1936, the collections are moved from Shanghai to Nanjing. By the summer of 1936, they are installed. By late 1936, they're all installed in Nanjing. 1937, the Marco Polo Bridge incident, and all-out war with Japan begins. After heavy fighting in Shanghai, the Japanese begin their advance out of Shanghai, up the Yangtze River Valley towards Nanjing. By late 1937, the Japanese are only weeks away from Nanjing, and the 20,000 cases containing the flower of the Imperial art collections are still in Nanjing. The Japanese approach the walls of Nanjing in mid-late November. The Palace Museum finds itself trying to evacuate 20,000 cases of art and has only a matter of weeks to do it. The palace commandeers trucks, hires hundreds of porters, takes over locomotives and rolling stock, hires steamships on the Yangtze River from the British company Butterfield and Swire. In late November 1937, hundreds of porters are loading the cases, 20,000 of them, aboard trains at the Xiaguan station and aboard steamers, Yangtze River steamers at the Xiaguan docks on the Yangtze River, day and night. Japanese bombers are pounding the city. The docks are overwhelmed with refugees. The entire transport infrastructure is overwhelmed as the Republic tries to bring war material to the front to halt the Japanese advance. It's an awful, awful moment, and there are wonderful reminiscences written by the curators describing the scene on the docks with these thousands of refugees surging towards the ships as the porters are struggling to load these thousands of cases aboard the Yangtze River steamers. The curators managed to get 17,000 of the 20,000 cases out of Nanjing. 3,000 get left behind. The last cases leave Nanjing just 10 days before the Japanese take the city, with all that was to follow. Now this colossal journey really gets underway. It goes in 3 parts. From Nanjing, late 1937, the first tranche of cases take what are called the southern route. They go the Yangtze River all the way up here to Wuhan. Then they go by train to Changsha, where they are stored in a university library for a while. Then they go south by truck deep into Guangxi province, and then up into Guizhou province, where the museum, where Ma Heng himself, in fact, has been scrambling in and out of caves, looking for a cave that would be a suitable place to store at least some of these cases that would be bomb-proof and dry for the duration of the war. He finds a place in a little village called Anshun, and only 80 cases, but 80 cases containing some of the finest, most irreplaceable pieces in the imperial collections, including the Song dynasty landscapes by Xia Guan and Fan Guan and people like that. They all go to Anshun, where they are stored in a cave for the next 7 years under the guardianship of the curator named Zhuang Yan and his family, and a company of soldiers. I was able to interview the son of Zhuang Yan, who's in his late 80s now, but who was able to give me eyewitness account of what that was like and how the family lived and what they ate and where they slept and how they conserved the art and what that entire experience was like growing up in rural Guizhou during the war. That route takes a year. It takes them a year to make that trip. The second route is known as the Central Route, and it goes all the way up the Yangtze River by steamship. First up to Wuhan, then on to Yichang, up the 3 gorges on upper Yangtze River steamers, to Chongqing. The bombing of Chongqing begins in May 1938. Everybody understands the cases are no longer safe there. They have to go on up to Yibin. They have to wait in Yibin for the Min River to rise. The Min River is full of rocks and sandbars, so they're stuck in temporary storage in leaky, drafty warehouses. And then they go up the Min River, and they end up at Leshan, where they in turn are taken up another tributary called the Dadu River aboard bamboo rafts. This is 9,000 cases of art loaded with the imperial collections. Porters are putting them onto bamboo rafts, and then trackers on the riverbanks, squads of people on the riverbanks, are pulling these bamboo rafts upstream against the current using bamboo ropes attached to the front of the rafts. And steersmen with bamboo poles are steering the rafts up the Dadu River. They're unloaded on the muddy riverbank, and 9,000 cases of art are ported on shoulder poles across the fields to their storage place, which is temples and ancestral halls in a quiet village called Angu, just outside Leshan. And there, those 9,000 cases will remain for the duration of the war, under the guardianship of a curator named Na Zhiliang and his family. He wrote a very, very beautiful, powerful memoir of this time, which was one of my primary sources. The third and worst of the 3 journeys is the northern route, which goes from Nanjing in 1937 back north by rail, and then heads by train the whole way into Shanxi province to Baoji, which is where the railway line ends. The Japanese are advancing right behind. At times, these cases are only sort of weeks ahead of the Japanese. But they run out of railway line in Baoji, and they don't know what to do. And they haven't got a plan for where these cases are going to end up. In the winter of 1938, already a year after leaving Nanjing, 7,000 cases are loaded onto trucks and are driven over the Qinling Mountains. That's the highest mountain range in China outside Tibet. It goes up to 12,000 feet. And the roads are extraordinary. They're switchbacks up through these forests to snowbound peaks, and then down the other side into a valley, the Hanshui Valley, where the city of Hanzhong is. Absolutely awful, awful, terrifying journey. Trucks are overturning. They're getting stuck in snowdrifts up in isolated villages. Everyone's freezing. There's nothing to eat. It's absolutely horrifying. When they leave Hanzhong, they decide they're going to head for Chengdu. When they leave Hanzhong, the Japanese have bombed all the bridges on the road down from Hanzhong down to Chengdu. So every river, every stream that they go over, they have to raft these 7,000 cases over these rivers. The trucks have to nose their way down to the muddy riverbank where porters load the cases onto these bamboo rafts. And again, the boatmen pole the rafts upstream against the current and let them drift back down while they steer the rafts across the stream to the other side. Aside from the kind of horrifying danger of trucks on a bamboo raft and the worry about the raft overturning and the cases disappearing into the river, it was incredibly slow. It took them months and months to get the cases down to Chengdu. And by the time these 9,000 cases arrive in Angu, just outside Leshan, it's September 1939. It's a year and a half since they've left Nanjing. And here, they'll stay eventually they'll make their way to Ermei, just at the foot of Ermeishan, where in 2 enormous temples in Ermei, they will be stacked and stored, and they will remain for the duration of the war there under the eye of a curator named Ouyang Daoda, who wrote the definitive account of this entire journey. During this period, an awful lot happens. It's crisis after crisis, improvisation after improvisation, and in the book I get into some detail about some of these episodes. At one point in Baoji, a truck is driving away from the railway station, goes over a level crossing, and the driver doesn't look both ways, and a locomotive comes crashing into the side of this truck and smashes the truck to pieces and smashes a load of cases to pieces. The packing was so effective that not much got broken, and the worst casualties in that particular disaster were, strangely enough, a couple of cases full of glass domes that were used to cover clocks and were entirely valueless. Nothing else serious got broken in that disaster. In Chongqing, on the central route here, the cases got unloaded at one point into an old warehouse which used to store opium. It's been disused for years and no one's inspected the floor. They start stacking the cases on top of each other. The floor is rotten and it gives way, and piles of cases go crashing down 15 feet into the basement, and several cases are shattered. And the curators relate climbing down into this dark basement and picking up the pieces of the cases and trying to figure out what the damage is. And Ouyang Daoda, the curator, writes a complete list of every piece that got broken. A whole load of Ming and Qing porcelain smashed, ritual wine goblets, Jue goblets all got smashed. Zhou period bronzes lost their legs and their handles. The damage was awful. Every time Ouyang Daoda, this particular curator, makes a list of when one of these incidents happens, he lists everything that gets broken, and you can just tell in his writing that the guy is undergoing a martyrdom every single time this happens. And he says each time he writes, "What was the point of us leaving Peking to save the imperial collections from the Japanese? if when we get here, we're just going to break it all. And he sends out these strongly worded letters all the time to the other curators, demanding that they stop dropping the cases and breaking all this stuff. During the war, how am I doing for time? During the war, these curators and their families and the Palace Museum staff live out the war years in these little villages out in western Sichuan. They are a part of a much larger migration. Tens of millions of people have left Western China. Factories have left, museums have left, universities have left, schools have left, the government's left, and taken part in this colossal migration from Eastern China to Western China in the face of the Japanese advance. Japan has developed extremely effective long-range aviation, and the G3M and G4M bombers manufactured by Mitsubishi and Nakajima are able to hit everywhere in Western China. The bombing is incessant. It goes on year after year after year. The Republic settles into a war of attrition in North and Central China. Casualties are colossal. Historians, well, we don't really know how many people died in China in World War II, but the estimates are between 14 and 20 million people. Perhaps 5 to 6 million military deaths, perhaps 15 million civilian deaths. Starvation and famine all through 1942-43 in central China, other isolated famines all over China. The blowing of the Yangtze River dikes, the Yellow River dikes, I'm sorry, in an attempt to slow down the Japanese advance, takes the lives of an estimated 800,000 Chinese people in drowning, starvation, and disease, just in one incident alone. The scale of this war is really beggars the imagination, and yet, as I say, it appears weirdly absent from contemporary representation of World War II in the English-speaking world, and I don't really understand why. 1945, Japan surrenders and the last chapter of this story begins. The more than 17,000 cases packed with the Imperial collections that are in Western China now must make the journey all the way back. First to Nanjing, and then, the curators hope, back to the Forbidden City in Peking. They do this in 1946 and 47 on enormous naval landing craft. They are trucked to the Yangtze River, and over the course of a year, the cases are taken by landing craft the whole way back up the Yangtze to Nanjing. By March 1947, the cases are all back at the storage facility in Nanjing. But as they make this colossal journey in reverse, China is, of course, slipping back into civil war. The communists are moving in Manchuria, up in the northeast. The Republic begins to collapse. In 1948, the government of the Republic under Chiang Kai-shek decides to retreat to Taiwan. Chiang Kai-shek orders his government, his military, and to begin preparations for the retreat to Taiwan. He decides to take with him all of China's gold bullion reserves, and he orders that the very finest pieces of the imperial collections shall go to Taiwan as well. The Palace Museum curators, Ma Hong and his staff, are ordered to begin selecting the very finest pieces for evacuation to Taiwan. Ma Hong himself, who is now director of the Palace Museum, stays in Peking. He refuses to leave. His reasons are not entirely clear. A lot of the Peking intelligentsia are getting on planes out now. They're flying south to Nanjing, and they're going to Taiwan. Ma Hong's great friend Hu Shi has already gone. Fu Senyan has gone. Li Ji, the great archaeologist, is packing up all his stuff, his finds from the Anyang excavation, and he's heading for Taiwan. But Ma Hong, director of the Palace Museum and conservator of the imperial collections, refuses to go. Was it a sense of duty? Was it loyalty to his own people? Was it that he had been assured by the communist underground that he would be well treated and the Forbidden City would be well treated? There is evidence that that took place, but it's not conclusive. One of Ma Hong's sons was deeply involved with the communist underground and was an ally of Ye Jianying, the famed PLA Red Army Marshal. The evacuation of the finest pieces of the imperial collections gets underway from Nanjing to Taiwan at the end of 1948. December for 1948, a tank landing ship, that's what that is, it's called an LST, landing ship tank, built in the United States, gifted to the Republic of China by the US Navy at the end of the war. An LST is moored in Nanjing. Absolute chaos on the Nanjing docks. Thousands of the Republic of China's military are desperately seeking passage to Taiwan to flee the advancing communists. They are swamping every ship that they can get on. The cases, thousands of cases of imperial art are on the docks waiting to be loaded. Finally, at the insistence of the Republic of China Navy, the cases make their way onto one of these LSTs and they begin the move to Taiwan. 3 shipments go, one at the end of 48 and 2 in early 49. 3,000 cases out of the 20,000 are taken to Taiwan. 20,000 pieces of porcelain, hundreds of the most important paintings in the imperial collections, 150,000 volumes of rare books, thousands of works in jade, all make their way to Taiwan. The imperial collections are now split between those that were left behind in Peking, those that are in Nanjing, and those that have now made their way to Taiwan. And the curators themselves, who for the last 16 years under the leadership of Ma Heng have been conserving these 20,000 cases of art through thick and thin, they're now split as well. Half of them go to Taiwan, but half of them stay on the mainland. And they will never see each other again. The final chapter of the book deals with the fate of the curators who remain on the mainland and wait for the communist takeover, particularly Ma Heng. It's a difficult story. I imagine many of you are familiar with what happened to the Peking intelligentsia in the early days of the communist takeover. Ma Heng suddenly starts keeping a diary at around this time, so we get a very graphic sense of what happened to him and to the Forbidden City and to the Peking intelligentsia of the time. I'm not going to go into great detail, but he fell afoul of the Sanfan campaign, was, after devoting his life to conserving the imperial collections and keeping them together, he was detained and went through months of interrogation at the hands of Communist Party inquisitors. And he died in 1955, humiliated and deeply traumatized and very depressed. It's not a happy ending to the story on the mainland. The curators who went to Taiwan prospered, as did the collections. That's a picture of the cases stacked in storage on Taiwan in 1950. You can see the wooden cases there in great detail, together with the label, a very complex labeling system that they had to keep track of every single piece in every single case. They knew exactly where every case was all the time through 16 years because of this terrific labeling system. The curators who went to Taiwan, among them Zhuang Yan and Na Zhiliang, took up positions at the new Palace Museum, Taipei. The collections found a home there, and that's where they remain today. Those pieces that went across the Taiwan Strait in early 1949 formed the heart of the collection of the Palace Museum, Taipei. So in its larger context, this is a story about art and the people who saw the imperial art collections on this extraordinary journey. But it's also a story about nationhood and the way that a generation of Chinese people tried to engender a sense of nation through fostering a sense of national culture and a shared national history through these objects in the imperial collections, the establishment of the Palace Museum, opening the collections to the public, and later this incredible act of conservation. I hope it's also a story about the Second World War in China and an invitation to the reader to perhaps reconsider a little bit the scale and the scope of the Second World War beyond what we normally think of, the war in Europe, particularly in the war in the Pacific. And to become, perhaps we could all, I think, become a little bit more alert to the variety of stories and voices and experiences that make up that time and the lived experience of the Second World War. And I'll leave it there and we'll open it up to questions. Thank you very much for listening this far. Who's got anything that we'd like to kind of open up on? Yeah.
Have you visited these collections yourself?
Yes, well, I mean, I've been to the Palace Museum, Beijing, many times. I lived in China for a long time. As part of the research for the book, I went to the Palace Museum Taipei several times, and they were very helpful in helping me research the story and pointing me to source material. They would never let me back into the storage areas to actually see. They've preserved some of these original cases, and even some of the packing materials. There is some of the original straw, and I don't know whether you've seen it, but there is some of the original packing materials are stored inside the Palace Museum Taipei, but they'd never give me permission to go back into the vaults to see it, which was a shame. But yeah, you can see a lot of it on display. It's all there. It's all visible. Yeah.
Is that on? Yeah. Two quick fact questions.
Yeah.
What happened to the residual that never left Beijing?
Right.
Because the Japanese, of course, advanced into North China and Beijing, and so the question is, how did they treat? Did they have knowledge of those material objects inside the Gugong? And second, given that the fate of Ma Heng is, in historiographical terms, is complex, are there books about him and his demise? Is he cast as a hero who was caught up in the tumult of modern China? Is it all kind of anodyne? What's the discourse about Ma Heng today in China?
So when the Japanese take Peking in 1937, the Palace Museum, the Forbidden City, locks itself down. They shut all the gates. They crate up as much as they can of the remaining art inside the Forbidden City, and they store it. The Japanese do make their way into the Forbidden City. They go to the chief curator who's been left behind, a man named Zhang Tingji, on his own there, basically, trying to manage, trying to cope. The museum has no money. Obviously, remittances are not coming through from Nanjing anymore, from the central government. And now he's got the Japanese to deal with as well. And importantly, he's got Chinese collaborators to deal with. This was an important problem for him. He does extremely well. He manages to fend off the advances of the Japanese. The Japanese come in and they take all the maps to start with. They destroy any material inside the Forbidden City that they think is seditious or anti-Japanese. Lots of literature, periodicals, stuff like that. But they don't plunder. Zhang Tingji is not quite sure why, and the theory goes that the Japanese were planning to bring Puyi, the last emperor, back down from Manchuria and install him as a puppet emperor of all China back in the Forbidden City. So they didn't want to destroy the Forbidden City. Elsewhere in China, they plundered, they looted, they burned universities, they burned everything. The United Nations figured post-war that China had 4,200 libraries before the Japanese invasion. By 1946, it had 800 libraries left. That gives you a scale of the devastation in Chinese cities. So the Forbidden City itself got off quite likely. It's that Peking story where everybody just pulls back at the last minute and doesn't destroy Peking. Happens repeatedly through the 20th century. Zhang Tingji ends up being a lonely hero, and the Forbidden City falls into terrible disrepair, but the remainder of the collections, the less important stuff that's left behind, doesn't actually get plundered by the Japanese. Ma Heng himself is a tricky figure, and the version of his story that gets told inside the PRC is different to the story that gets told in Taiwan. In the PRC, he is today hailed as a figure who tried to stop the collections leaving for Taiwan. That isn't actually what happened. There are a series of letters that he wrote. I want to get too in the weeds, but Ma Heng is on paper telling his curators, look, if the central government is ordering you to go to Taiwan, you're going to have to go to Taiwan. There's nothing I can do about it. That letter gets suppressed in the PRC telling of the story. He is a national hero for his role. What happens to him in the Sanfan campaign and the end of his life is completely glossed over. Though interestingly, his diary, his full diary, including the Sanfan campaign period, was only just published 3 years ago. An abridged version had been published earlier. But for some reason, someone took the decision to tell his full story and allow the diary to be published quite recently, which I was very surprised about. So yeah, he's a complex figure. He's not well understood. There is biographical material about him in Chinese. A big Nianpu has just been published by his grandson right after my manuscript went in, infuriatingly. But he's a greatly overlooked figure, and particularly his role in establishing modern archaeology in China, I think, is something that is not well understood, and I think would be a great research topic. Yeah.
Thank you so much for a talk. So first, just an observation. Are you familiar with Justin Jacobs' book, The Compensation of Plunder? Yeah, I reviewed it, and it speaks directly to your argument about national heritage. Okay, so the other thing was about the memory hole that you mentioned, which also concerns me a lot in teaching World War II in China. One thing that has struck me is that part of the problem of the memory hole is that in order for it to operate, we need to write the Soviet Union out of the story, because the Soviet Union plays a kind of a double game in the 1930s and the 1940s. So first they're encouraging the conflict between China and Japan and are encouraging the communists and the nationalists to unite, thereby fanning the flames of the conflict. And then when the conflict peaks, the Soviet Union withdraws from the war and concludes a non-aggression pact with Japan that lasts for 4 years. And it's striking to me the amount of textbooks that we assign to students that don't even mention this anti-aggression pact, because it represents a fundamental betrayal of China on the part of the Soviet Union. And for that memory hole to operate, that has to be sort of written out of the story. And I think, so it's not so much an Anglo-Saxon problem, I think, as it has to do with a remembrance of World War II at large. And many of these questions are now kind of being aired in the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine. So I just wanted to sort of add that for that Anglo-Saxon memory hole to work, it requires that we write the Soviet Union out of the story in terms of China's fate during World War II. Thanks.
No, I think fascinating, yeah. And in terms of that historiography, it seems to me that we place China's experience in this sort of discrete delineated space where it's generally referred to as the Second Sino-Japanese War, and not really a coherent and integrated part of the Second World War, and particularly the Soviet Union stance. And the degree to which the war in China was central to Stalin's planning to defend his eastern flank, which is a very important strategic question, and I don't think we understand it very well. So in some level, I'm kind of tempted to think that the strategic significance of the war in China is perhaps, like you say, it's less important to the rest of the war in East Asia, and it's more important actually the war in Europe. It plays a larger role in determining Stalin's equation than it does anybody else's. When I think about it in terms of it being like an Anglophone problem, I'm thinking of a much more basic level, which is simply that if you go into a bookshop in the United States or Europe and you go to the World War II shelf, there's this monumental industry in World War II publishing. But if you look at the World War II shelf, there is never a book about China on that shelf. If you want to see any of the fantastic work done on World War II China by any number of people, Mark Peaty, Rainer Mitter, Hans van der Ven, and all these great historians. You have to go to the Asia shelf, which is at the back of the store at ankle height, right, before you can find books about World War II in China. So we have this weird habit of sort of excising China's World War from the rest of World War II. And in popular representations of the sort that dominate our kind of visual understanding, the visual culture surrounding World War II, everything from Band of Brothers to Saving Private Ryan, to the Spielberg, Hanks, Ambrose cultural industrial complex that dominates contemporary understanding of World War II. It's completely absent from popular representation, which strikes me as strange and odd and wrong, and skews our vision of World War II towards a few very highly polished narratives that allow us to cast World War II purely in terms of nation, sacrifice, duty, a titanic clash of democracy versus fascism, when clearly, even a cursory reading of World War II history tells you that the story is so much more complicated. But our culture seems to lean our popular culture seems to lean so heavily towards the Battle of Britain, Normandy, the dropping of the atomic bomb, island hopping in the Pacific, and everything outside that is excluded. And all our thoughts are channeled into these very narrow, reductive kind of versions of World War II. I think that's beginning to change a bit. I kind of hope it is, and I think there's more interesting writing and sort of more muted stories as we emerge from under the shadow of Stephen Ambrose and Steven Spielberg. Perhaps we'll start to get more interesting stuff. Yeah.
I have a question from the virtual audience. To your point regarding this history as a story of a Chinese people creating a national culture, how do we account for the role of foreigners like John C. Ferguson, who helped to evaluate the Imperial art collection after the fall of the Qin dynasty?
Very, very good question. And fascinatingly, John C. Ferguson, the famous American collector and scholar, was a close friend of my guy, Ma Heng. They worked very closely together, and together they, using Zhou dynasty artifacts, they managed to work out mathematically the length of a Zhou dynasty of a Zhou dynasty foot. Measurements in the Zhou dynasty were not understood until the 1920s. So when you read Zhou period texts that referred to measures of length, nobody knew how long the measures of length were, so nobody knew how big anything was. And it was John C. Ferguson and Ma Heng together who figured out how long these measures of length actually were. So Ferguson, I think, provided encouragement to people like Ma Heng at the time. He gave them a window into the world. He brought them resources. He acted as a sort of bridge. He, I don't know, what's the word? Validated, legitimized their effort. He was a part of a larger hunger at the time, I think, on the part of Chinese historians and curators and art historians to start importing Western techniques of curation and archaeology and conservation that was very much alive in the early 1920s. So he and his kind were an important part. I don't think they were the main thrust of it. I think that came from the Chinese curators themselves, particularly people like Li Ji, like Ma Heng, Tsai Wen-pei himself, and the others who established the Institute of Archaeology at Peking University and the Academia Sinica. It was a crucible of a time, and people were all very sort of caught up, and Ferguson was one of them, yeah.
Excuse me, I'm over here. Thank you so much for your talk. This was really fascinating, and I think came at a good time for myself too. I'm reading this book right now called Ravensbrück by Sarah Helm, if you're familiar, and it's about this little studied concentration camp outside of Berlin that predominantly was a work camp, slave camp. Anyway, it's
It's where all the SOE women were taken, wasn't
yes, yeah, and it's fits into this theme like little studied parts of World War II. But really, what I'm interested in is this idea that you brought up that the imperial collections end up being split between Peking, Nanjing, and Taiwan. If that's correct. And I think I have some ideas on like what that means to split up an imperial collection. But for starters, I'm curious on your thoughts about what that means to split up an imperial collection between different places. But I'm also interested in this idea you brought up of the curators being separated, and what does that mean for the people who have worked to preserve this art themselves as a group to be isolated and no longer with the collection? That makes sense?
Yeah, the collections, I use collections plural because what was in the Forbidden City wasn't really a collection in the way that we in the United States or Europe would understand it. It wasn't assembled for status or connoisseurship. It had a different set of functions. The splitting of it means that, firstly, practically, it means that the original disposition of the collections inside the Forbidden City, as generally laid down by the Qianlong Emperor, have never been recreated. So we never know, we're never able to see or experience what those collections were like in their original context. That's the first practical thing. The splitting across the Taiwan Strait, obviously at a national level, it's been very problematic for years and years. There was a period in the early 2000s when the two museums, the one in Peking and the one in Taiwan, were getting on pretty well. And there was a lot of exchange going on, and a whole load of academics from both sides of the Taiwan Strait retraced this whole trip. They all got together and put on their hiking boots, and they went the whole way across China, and they retraced it, and they wrote a collective article discussing it. And it was all everything was going very well. And then all that stopped in about 2012, 2014, and relations since then have been much tenser and much more difficult. The collection in Taiwan has a slightly precarious position because it is emblematic of a sense of a broader unified sense of Chineseness, which is of course rejected by quite a lot of Taiwanese people. So among some Taiwanese people, particularly over on the kind of DPP end of the spectrum these days, there's a certain amount of resentment at the presence of the Palace Museum in these collections because they're not Taiwanese and they sort of act as a kind of cultural anchor, anchoring Taiwan's elite culture to that of the PRC. And there's some tension around that, and it's difficult for them to resolve. In terms of the kind of personal legacy, the families involved in the curation of all this also find themselves in a tricky position because they have this huge kind of legacy weighing on their shoulders. There is a diary in Taiwan kept by one of the curators, 7 volumes thick. I've seen it. I've even been allowed to glimpse pages in it, but the family would never let me look at it. Everybody wants this diary. The Taida, Taiwan National University wants this diary. Academia Sinica wants it. The Palace Museum wants it. Palace Museum Beijing wants it. Everybody's begging the family, the Zhuang family, for this diary. And the family won't give it up. And when I asked them, why won't you, this is so crucial to this sense of understanding this period. Why won't you let us look at it? And it was literally sort of, 不太方便. It's just like, there's stuff in here that was going to be embarrassing. It was going to embarrass people at the time. It was going to embarrass their legacy. It was going to embarrass their families. What stuff was it? I don't know. Is it about corruption? Is it about art getting stolen or lost? Does something in there diverge from official tellings of the story? We don't know, but we're not learning about it because the Zhuang family is never giving that diary up. So there's much still to be understood about the story, but there's also a kind of live political legacy surrounding these objects that's still quite kind of invested with, quite fraught, loaded with tension today. Yeah.
I have one more question from the virtual audience. Follow up. What about during the Cultural Revolution? Was the Peking collection affected during that period?
Great question. As we know, across China during the Cultural Revolution, a lot of China's patrimony was, cultural patrimony was destroyed. As I understand it, and I don't understand it very well, and this isn't part of my book or my research, but the Forbidden City was shut down, closed off during the Cultural Revolution and protected by the People's Liberation Army, as I understand it, at the instigation of Zhou Enlai. I think that's what happened. It's probably a lot more complicated than that. But the Forbidden City did survive the Cultural Revolution, and it was never vandalized to any great degree by Red Guards, as I understand it. So once again, it managed to escape one of these extraordinary moments of transition in 20th century Chinese history, more or less unscathed.
Thank you so much for telling the stories. I have a couple of questions. One is that have you looked at the Tianjin collection and also the Shenyang Gugong, that route, because that also was kind of outflow of the Imperial collection. Another thing is about I was thinking about whether this was part of this response to looting. From the earlier times when the European armies looted Yuanmingyuan, of course, that was also part of the Imperial collection. And archaeological looting also happened around that time. Of course, this was out of this phenomena of the rise of antique market at that time. So, for example, before the excavation of Anyang in the 1920s, the oracle bone scrapes, the oracle bone objects already were sold in Beijing. So in a sense, the organized archaeology was part of the response to looting, basically. That also started from the 1920s. So there was a kind of general fear of loss or being illegally taken away. Another thing is, of course, the looting was also probably part of the story of the expeditionist activities, because, for example, before the war, the Japanese archaeologists already did like quite comprehensive surveying across a lot of ancient sites, including like Yungang Buddhist site. They took photographs, they published. So they already kind of mapped out all the cultural heritage on the land of China before the war. And of course,
so they knew what they were looking for a lot of the time. Yeah.
Yes. So I just maybe maybe it was a kind of a thing that might be part of that kind of activity.
The funny thing about this is that when the curators write about what they're doing when they're packing and they're getting ready to leave, everything is kind of taken for granted in their minds, and they're not very explicit about why they're doing what they're doing. But clearly the looting of Peking in 1900 by the Allied armies and the Japanese at the time, the desecration of the Qing tombs in 1928 was very important for Ma Heng. He was deeply involved in the response to that. And the general, as you say, the growth of antiques markets and the growing Western demand for Chinese artifacts was very much at the forefront of their minds through the 1920s. And much of what Ma Heng was doing was campaigning to have legislation to protect sort of national patrimony and to protect artifacts. So, yeah, it's the question of looting and loss I haven't gone into in great detail here, but it is layered through the story at every level. It's ever present. And I'm certain that one of the central reasons they packed and evacuated in 1933 was they envisaged a moment when Japanese troops would come pouring into the Forbidden City and just start loading up their haversacks the way that they did in 1900 and before that in 1860. Yeah, absolutely no doubt. Yeah.
And do you know about the Tianjin?
Yeah, I don't know much about that. I do know that the other imperial palaces had a little museum going as early as 1914, actually, in the imperial precincts just outside the Forbidden City. It was called the Government Museum, or the Gallery of Antiquities, and that was made up of artifacts that had been brought in from imperial palaces in Shenyang and elsewhere. So I know that there was something going on with that, but I don't understand it terribly well. Yeah.
So Ina has just told me that there's a spike in sales for a forthcoming title from Simon and Schuster. It's called Fragile Cargo, which hopefully is a result of today's exercise. But seriously, I want to thank Adam so much for coming to the University of Michigan to present this book today. As one of us said, it's a fascinating story, and it's superbly told by you, and in particular the questions the way you answered questions, added all sorts of levels of complexity and interest for all of us. So we should all give him a round of applause. And I guess if you're in Zoom land, you do this with your fingers, right? So cheers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.